At the dawn of the 20th century, the Armenian people formed one of the most prominent Christian communities within the Ottoman Empire. With roots in Anatolia, stretching back over 2 millennia, Armenians had developed a rich culture, a distinct language, and a deeply ingrained presence in the eastern regions of the empire. Yet by the end of the First World War, this ancient population had been devastated. What led to the near erasure of Armenians from Anatolia remains one of the most debated and tragic chapters of modern history. Armenia became the first state to adopt Christianity as a national religion, centuries before the religion spread in Europe. Despite periods of foreign domination, Armenian nobility, clergy, and merchant classes preserved their language, alphabet, and church, creating a continuous and vibrant cultural presence in eastern Anatolia. When the Seljuk Turks arrived in the 11th century and later the Mongols, Armenians often adapted by shifting political alliances or migrating to safer areas. Cilician Armenia, a Christian kingdom on the Mediterranean coast, flourished between the 11th and 14th centuries. Though it fell to the Mamluks in 1375, it remained a key part of the Armenian historical consciousness. By the time the Ottomans absorbed eastern Anatolia in the 16th century, Armenians were already well established with dense settlements, monasteries, and trade networks across the region. Armenians were one of the empire's largest non-Muslim ethnic groups, numbering up to 2 million before First World War. They lived across the empire with a strong concentration in the so-called 6 Armenian vilayets of the eastern provinces: Erzurum, Van Bitlis, Harput, Diyarbakir, and Sivas. However, significant populations also existed in western Anatolia and major cities like Istanbul, where they were active in trade crafts, education, and professions such as law and medicine. Although Armenians had certain communal rights under the Ottoman millet system, which allowed religious minorities autonomy in personal matters, they remained second-class citizens, subject to extra taxation, social discrimination, and political exclusion. Over time, as nationalist ideologies began to spread throughout Europe and the Middle East, calls for Armenian reform and autonomy grew louder. Some Armenians joined political movements seeking self-determination, which alarmed the Ottoman authorities. The late 19th century saw increasing instability in the empire. As the Ottoman state weakened, Sultan Abdülhamid responded to both internal and external pressures with authoritarian rule. Between 1894 and 1896, a wave of massacres targeting Armenians occurred across eastern Anatolia, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 100,000 to 300,000 people. These were known as the Hamidian massacres, named after the Sultan. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 brought a brief moment of hope. The Committee of Union and Progress, which led the revolution, initially promised equality and constitutional governance. However, their increasing embrace of Turkish nationalism soon took a darker turn. By the time the Ottoman Empire entered First World War on the side of the Central Powers in late 1914, the leadership of the committee had become intensely suspicious of Armenian loyalty. In 1915, as the war escalated and the Russian army advanced into eastern Anatolia, aided by Armenian volunteer units, the Committee of Union and Progress began executing a systematic plan to eliminate the Armenian population. The justification was security. The state claimed Armenians were collaborating with the Russians and posed an existential threat to the empire's stability. In reality, the measures taken went far beyond military necessity. On 24 April 1915, hundreds of Armenian intellectuals and community leaders were arrested in Istanbul. This event is now commemorated as the beginning of the Armenian genocide. Over the next 2 years, mass deportations, executions, and forced marches decimated the Armenian population. Men were often killed outright. Women, children, and the elderly were deported toward the Syrian desert under appalling conditions. Many died from starvation, disease, or massacres along the way. Turkey, while recognizing these events as a painful chapter in its history, emphasizes that they do not constitute genocide. From the Turkish perspective, Armenian groups who rebelled against the Ottoman Empire were punished, but some innocent people were also harmed during this process. Nevertheless, Turkey adopts an approach that acknowledges and empathizes with the suffering of the Armenian side. By the end of the war, the Armenian presence in Anatolia had been almost entirely eradicated. Survivors who managed to flee found refuge in countries like Syria, Lebanon, France, Russia, and later the United States. Thus began the Armenian diaspora, a community now numbering millions scattered across the globe, but unified by memory culture and a shared sense of loss. In the short-lived Treaty of Sèvres of 1920, the victorious Allies proposed the creation of an independent Armenian state in eastern Anatolia. However, the rise of the Turkish national movement under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and the eventual Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 erased those provisions. To this day, the Republic of Turkey does not officially acknowledge the events of 1915 as genocide. The Turkish state has historically portrayed the deportations as a tragic but necessary wartime response to Armenian insurrection. This stance has been backed by a strict state policy of denial censorship and the criminalization of genocide claims in Turkish law. Over the decades, a growing number of Turkish scholars, writers, and civil society organizations have challenged this official narrative. The assassination of Hrant Dink, a prominent Armenian-Turkish journalist and advocate for reconciliation in 2007, shocked many in Turkey and sparked a broader conversation about the country's history and minorities. Outside Turkey, the Armenian genocide has been recognized by dozens of countries, including France, Germany, Russia, and most recently the United States. Recognition often provokes diplomatic backlash from Ankara, which sees such declarations as attacks on Turkish national identity. Today, the Armenian population in Turkey is a small remnant of its former size, estimated at between 50,000 and 70,000 people, mostly in Istanbul. The community maintains its churches, schools, and cultural institutions, but still faces social discrimination and political sensitivity. Issues such as property rights, hate speech, and restrictions on religious freedoms continue to challenge the full integration and security of Turkey's Armenian citizens. Despite these challenges, the Armenian presence in Istanbul retains symbolic importance. Places like the Armenian Patriarchate, the Getronagan High School, and Armenian newspapers such as Agos are testaments to the resilience of a people who refuse to let their identity be erased. The question of why Armenians were wiped out from Anatolia is not only historical but deeply moral. It forces us to confront the outcomes of nationalism, war, and ethnic scapegoating. It reminds us of what can happen when prejudice is institutionalized and when those in power turn against their own citizens. This situation closely concerns not only Turkey and Armenia, but also other countries in the region, and it has negative implications for regional peace. The perception of Turkey and Armenia as incompatible nations on the international stage indirectly affects global peace. Moreover, the fact that peoples living in the same geography view each other from behind closed borders is a harsh reality that is difficult to accept in today's globalized world.